To see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower, to hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? In what distant deeps or skies burnt the fire of thine eyes? On what wings dare he aspire? What the hand dare seize the fire? And what shoulder and what art could twist the sinews of thy heart? And when thy heart began to beat, what dread hand and what dread feet? What the hammer, what the chain, in what furnace was thy brain? What the anvil, what dread grasp dare its deadly terrors grasp? When the stars threw down their spears and watered heaven with their tears, did he smile his work to see? Did he who made the lamb make thee? Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye dare frame thy fearful symmetry? William Blake, what a fascinating figure, the absolute pinnacle of an imaginative writer. Now, according to an essay I read by Philip Pullman, the power of imagination is being lost in our generation. It's considered too close to spirituality, God forbid, and to sort of lack of reason and insanity. Now, Blake was thought of as insane in his own day, and sometimes in our day too, because he saw visions and that kind of thing. Of course, we live in the age of pompous buffoons, such as that Richard Dawkins person who knows nothing about art, in which only things that pertain to staying alive are worth spending your time on, and things that make it worth being alive are being denigrated. For example, you can't do a PhD in literature or music anymore, which happen to be my areas. You have to sort of relate them to psychology and bring in something scientific, or else it's considered not worth spending money on by the powers that be. And actually, imagination is an essential part of human existence, and Blake very much knew that. He's a bit of a Marmite poet and a Marmite artist. People either love his work or hate it, or actually are kind of disturbed by it. So I don't know how much familiarity you at this point have with Blake, but let's look at some of his work and see what you think. The poems that I just quoted from at the start of this video were from Songs of Innocence and of Experience, which gives us that very famous line about infinity and eternity, and Tiger, tiger, burning bright. It's known as the Tiger, and tiger is spelt Tyger, and the tiger refers to Satan. So a bit esoteric, and he was a bit of a bad boy. But let's hear a little bit more about the life of William Blake. He was, of course, a painter and a printmaker, a visual artist, as well as a poet. I'm talking here a little bit more about his literary career as opposed to his paintings, but I did showcase some of his paintings at the start. When my mother's best friend died, she left us a copy of Blake's Vision of God, and that hung in our porch for many years. So I think that gives me an affection for the man. So, as I mentioned, he was a poet, a painter, a printmaker, and a notorious eccentric, might be the way to put it. He lived from 1757 until 1822. He was pretty much unrecognised during his life because he wasn't interested in making money from his art. He hated what he saw as crass commercialism. But he's now considered one of the most important figures of the Romantic age, and he is thought of as a romantic, but really he's hard to classify. He's almost in a world of his own. His most famous literary works, as we heard, were Songs of Innocence and of Experience, and of course Jerusalem. He referred to his poetry as prophetic works, relating to the sort of religious mythology he had created. And he thought of the imagination as the body of God, or human existence itself. So we humans were all about imagination. His contemporaries, of course, as I mentioned, believed him to be utterly insane. He was a theist, and he was very interested in portraying God. He also wrote about Satan, as we heard. But he eschewed the established Church of England, and he didn't pretty much like organised religion in general. He preferred to focus on his own mystical experiences, which he described often. And he associated himself with Marcionism. And that's a strand of theology which views Jesus as righteous and as really being a different person than the God of the Hebrew Old Testament. And it's more closely associated with the works of St. Paul. Now, politically, he was influenced by both the French and American revolutions and embraced their ideals at first, but like others among first-generation romantics, he was put off by the bloodshed of the Reign of Terror and later moved away from that. He did, however, remain good friends with Thomas Paine, who was an English-born American founding father and a supporter of the French Revolution. Although there are clear influences on Blake's work, such as his political ideology and his religious thinking, he can definitely be described as romantic in some of his ideas. And this idea of the senses and imagination, like he's a super extension of sensibility. But as I said before, he's kind of hard to classify. He's a bit of a literary enigma. He often collaborated with his wife, Catherine, who was Catherine Boucher, before she was married, and she acted as a printer and a colourist for his books. Scholar Angus Whitehead tells us for almost 45 years, she was the person who lived and worked most closely with Blake, enabling him to realise numerous projects impossible without her assistance. Catherine was an artist and printer in her own right, so he lived in this artistic partnership for much of his life. Blake was born in Soho in London, and he lived all his life in London apart from 3 years in Sussex, now West Sussex, in the place that he lived. He was the third of 7 children, 2 of whom died in infancy, and his father James was a hosier. In other words, he sold socks, trousers, anything related to a gentleman's legs. So Blake left school at the young age of 10 and was then taught at home by his mother Catherine, and he took up drawing classes as well. The Blakes were dissenters, in other words, they dissented to the established church, the Church of England, and followed a different form of Christianity, but he had been baptised in an Anglican church, St. James's Church in Piccadilly. He was inspired by the Bible right from his childhood and throughout his life. It really fired his imagination. He related having spiritual and mystical experiences, such as describing beholding God's face pressed against his window, seeing angels among the haystacks, and being visited by the Old Testament prophet Ezekiel, a particularly esoteric end-time prophet. And that quote comes from the Longman Anthology of English Literature. Now, there is a question mark over whether this was some kind of schizophrenic delusion or he did genuinely have spiritual experiences. Many people throughout the ages have relayed having spiritual experiences, and certainly he was able to live in society, whatever way his mind worked. Now, as an artist, he actually began by engraving copies of drawings of Greek antiquities, which were bought for him by his father, and he was very influenced by the Grand Masters. He was given enough books and paintings in his childhood for us to assume that the household was fairly affluent. He started drawing classes at the Strand aged 10, his parents having thought he wasn't getting on terribly well at sort of regular school, if we want to call it that. He also started to write poetry around then, and it was clear he was well read because he referenced Edmund Spenser, Ben Jonson, of course, the Renaissance period poets in England, and also the Book of Psalms. Blake worked as an apprentice at an engraving firm for 7 years, and the form of engraving he was taught was actually considered outmoded in its day, and because that was sort of an influence on him, critical appreciation of his art might have been negatively impacted. His employer sent him to copy Gothic images from Westminster Abbey, and that might have influenced his style and ideas as an artist, because There he saw suits of armour, waxworks and funeral effigies with these beautiful colours that were fading due to age. So the sort of gothic nature of his visual art might have derived a bit from that study. Unfortunately, while he was at Westminster Abbey, he was bullied by boys from the Westminster School who were allowed to visit the Abbey, and one of them tormented him so much that he eventually knocked him off a scaffold. Blake complained to the Dean about the behaviour he was experiencing, and his nemesis's visiting privileges were revoked. Blake, whilst he was at the Abbey, claimed to have seen visions of Christ and the apostles, and also monks and priests, and he also claimed to have heard the chanting of the monks and priests. Was he seeing ghosts? Was he having a delusion? Was this the power of his imagination? Can't really answer any of those questions. So he went on to study at the Royal Academy of Art, where he rebelled against the fashions of the day, which he considered unfinished. He had no interest in any part of his life in following what was fashionable or accepted. As an artist, he was pretty much a rebel. So while he was studying art, he made friends with some people with radical political views, and he joined the Society for Constitutional Information, and it aimed to spread information regarding the English Constitution and to lobby for parliamentary reform. Blake was actually in the front line at the Gordon riots, and that was civil unrest which broke out when Parliament revoked sanctions against Catholics. Being a Catholic in England, well, for centuries wasn't an easy thing. There was all kinds of things they weren't allowed to do. They didn't have civil freedoms. And these riots broke out when it was decided they should have a bit more freedom. Being Northern Irish, I don't think I should comment too much on that. But anti-Catholicism in England led to the deaths of many people over the centuries. So these riots are thought to have led to the formation of the first police force, or at least the first English police force. In 1781, Blake was reeling from a rejected marriage proposal. So he had a bit of a broken heart when he met Catherine Boucher. So if you're reeling from a broken heart, maybe the one for you is just round the corner. He told her parents and her about his romantic woes and asked her, "Do you pity me?" When she said yes, she did, he said, "Then I love you." Now, if some guy said to me, "I've just been dumped, do you pity me?" I think I would flee. And probably you would too, but this was the beginning of a beautiful relationship. They married in the Anglican St Mary's Church in Battersea on the 18th of August 1782. She was 5 years younger than him. And it was a successful marriage and successful artistic partnership. Blake taught Catherine to write, and he was pretty much a feminist in his thinking. He wanted to see women achieve their own individual fulfillment. We'll talk a little bit about that later. One of Catherine Blake's most noted works is the colouring of the cover of the book Europe, A Prophecy. In 2019, Tate Britain actually had an exhibition which gave particular focus to Catherine Blake's role in William Blake's work. Blake's first collection of poetry, Poetical Sketches, was printed sometime around 1783. Blake around that time also opened a print shop with his fellow former art student, and they worked with a radical publisher. So the publisher's house was a meeting place for intellectual dissidents, including Mary Wollstonecraft and Thomas Paine. Mary Wollstonecraft wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women. She was an early feminist and a feminist of note to this day, and her daughter was Mary Shelley. So Blake wore a Phrygian cap at this time to declare his sympathy with the French Revolution. Now, obviously, the powers that be at the time wanted to quash any idea of revolution, so this was a bit of a risky thing to do. It was like saying, I am a total rebel, and he knew he could get into trouble with it. But with the rise of Robespierre and the Reign of Terror, he began to lose faith in the revolution. In 1784, he worked on the unfinished manuscript of the prose satire An Island in the Moon. He illustrated Mary Wollstonecraft's children book. Now, I have to take a deep breath before reading its title. Original stories from real life with conversations calculated to regulate the affections and form the mind to truth and goodness, which was published in 1791. So she may be a radical, but that's a terribly moralising kind of a title. Can you imagine any child willingly reaching for that? Blake shared some of Wollstonecraft's feminist views, as we mentioned before. In his 1793 poem, Visions of the Daughters of Albion, he railed against enforced chastity and also loveless marriage, and expressed the right of women to self-fulfillment. In other words, to be independently happy. In 1800, he moved to a cottage in Feltham, now in West Sussex, then just thought to be in Sussex, to illustrate the works of the poet William Hayley, who was kind of a minor poet of the day. Whilst he was there, he began writing his long poem, Milton. Now, notice how Wordsworth was inspired by Milton's Paradise Lost in writing the prelude. It's all about Milton. Everybody was reading Milton because at that stage of the game, Milton was thought of as the absolute epitome of an English poet. And also because it was a religious subject matter in Paradise Lost, and Blake kind of resonated with that. The preface to Milton includes a poem that begins with the line, "And did those feet in ancient times," which later, of course, became the first line of his very well-known work, Jerusalem. Put to music by Hubert Parry, of course, and sung at women's institutes regularly, I'm led to believe, through watching Calendar Girls. Forgive me, I'm not English. So Blake began to resent Hayley, believing him to be not really interested in artistry, but more in crass commercialism. And this resentment may have influenced Milton, a poem, where he wrote, "Corporeal friends are spiritual enemies." Interesting. Blake had always had issues with authority, and this became particularly clear in August 1803 when he was involved in a physical fight with John Schofield, who was a soldier. Schofield accused Blake of having said, "Damn the king." Now that would be treason and very serious. "The soldiers are all slaves." So Blake was tried but acquitted, thankfully, at Chichester Assizes, with a Sussex paper noting that the invented character of the evidence was so obvious that an acquittal resulted. So he beat the rap, as we might say. Blake depicted Schofield wearing what he called mind-forged manacles in Jerusalem, the emanation of the great Albion. He returned to London in 1804 to write and illustrate one of his best-known works, Jerusalem. He had wanted to produce an engraving of the characters from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales to make a bit of money. Well, he wasn't all about making money, but he wanted to do this in a paid capacity around the time. But the dealer he approached felt that Blake's work was too esoteric to sell well. He wasn't a commercial artist. And so he approached Blake's friend Thomas Stothard with the concept. And so naturally, Blake stopped speaking to Stothard because it's not nice to steal work from your friends. He depicted Chaucer's characters himself in an exhibition in his brother's haberdashery shop. So he was always finding ways round things. If he was rejected or told he couldn't do something, he was liable to find a way. He wrote an attack on contemporary art at the time where he said something really interesting, which I think we should take to heart as scholars, which is to generalise is to be an idiot. In later life, Blake began to sell a great number of his works, his artistic works, particularly his Bible illustrations, to Thomas Butts, who was a patron who saw Blake more as a friend than someone whose art he liked. And that was typical of the opinions held of Blake throughout his life. His art was just considered a bit nuts at the time. Blake was busy working on engravings of scenes from Dante's Divine Comedy on the day that he died. He is reported as having suddenly stopped working and said to his wife, "Stay, Kate, Keep just as you are. I will draw your portrait, for you have ever been an angel to me. And then he completed the portrait, which is now lost, laid down his tools and began to sing hymns and verses. And then he died at about 6 p.m. Alexander Gilchrist, the author of a biography of Blake, reports that a female lodger in the house who was present when he died said, "I have been at the death not of a man, but of a blessed angel." He was always considered to be a bit of a spiritual figure by those who liked him. Catherine paid for Blake's funeral with money that was lent to her, and she couldn't afford a funeral well. And Blake was buried in a plot that he shared with other people 5 days after his death, on the eve of what would have been his 45th wedding anniversary, at the Dissenters' burial ground in Bunhill Fields, which is in the London borough of Islington today. And here it is, the big one, the most famous poem by William Blake. And perhaps the tune is running through your head when you read these words. Well, that's going to happen. And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green? And was the Holy Lamb of God, etc., etc. The tune added by Hubert Parry, of course, because it's so nationalistic. And we did say earlier on that nationalism is a feature of Romanticism. So, and did those feet in ancient times walk upon England's mountain green? And was the Holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pasture seen? Well, logically and factually, no, because Jesus lived in Israel in the first century. But the idea here of associating God with England is obviously so profoundly nationalistic that it made its way into a much-sung song. And did the countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills? And was Jerusalem builded here among these dark satanic mills? Now, the dark satanic mills are often alluded to. That comes from Blake's hatred of industrialisation, which he saw as destroying nature. Now, that's a debate that we're still having in modern times, but the Romantics' association with nature did set them at odds with some of the progress that was going on with the Industrial Revolution at the time. And the sense of nature being under threat is particularly evident in Blake. Bring me my bow of burning gold, bring me my arrows of desire, bring me my spear, O clouds unfold, bring me my chariot of fire. So the chariot of fire alludes to the biblical prophet Elijah, who did not die but was taken up to heaven. You can see Blake had a background in the Bible and was very influenced by it in this particular verse and throughout this poem. I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land. So the idea of a utopia, a perfect state that it's possible to have in England, is a really romantic one, and that's why Blake is classified as a romanticist. So here you can see the contents from Blake's Songs of Innocence and of Experience, which I'm here viewing on good old Project Gutenberg. So if we look at the Songs of Innocence, the shepherd, the echoing green, the lamb, the chimney sweeper, the little boy lost, it all sounds very romantic, doesn't it? In those kind of bucolic, lower class characters, and also there's a lot of allusion to nature there. As well as, of course, to the divine image, Holy Thursday. This is a very Blake collection. Then the Songs of Experience, Earth's Answer, The Clod and the Pebble, Holy Thursday. Again, the mixture of the natural and the spiritual. So let's have a little look at a Song of Innocence and then at a Song of Experience. Here's a Song of Innocence, and what could be more innocent than a little lamb? The lamb. Little lamb, who made thee? Does thou know who made thee, gave thee life and bid thee feed? by the stream and o'er the mead, gave thee clothing of delight, soft as clothing, woolly, bright, gave thee such a tender voice, making all the vales rejoice. Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Little lamb, I'll tell thee, little lamb, I'll tell thee, he is called by thy name, for he calls himself a lamb. He is meek and he is mild, he became a little child. I a child, and thou a lamb. We are called by his name. Little lamb, God bless thee. Little lamb, God bless thee. So it's almost like a hymn. But again, we have that image of the lamb and of nature. And the idea of the stream and or the mead. It sounds very much like something Wordsworth would have done apart from the Christian imagery. Now let's find a song of experience. This is the last of the songs of experience, the voice of the ancient bard. Now, ancient bards feature in Wordsworth, they feature in Coleridge. This is very much a romantic idea, or an idea that you find in the Romantic era. Youth of delight, come hither and see the opening morn. Image of truth newborn, doubt is fled and clouds of reason, dark disputes and artful teasing. Folly is an endless maze, tangled roots perplex her ways. How many have fallen there? They stumble all night o'er bones of the dead, and feel they know not what but care, and wish to lead others when they should be led. You'll notice the nature imagery there. The idea of tangled roots perplex her ways. So if things aren't going right with nature, things aren't going right spiritually. And that's an idea that we also found in Coleridge. Also the idea that folly is an endless maze, because a maze isn't something that you find in nature. A maze is man-made. So by extension, folly is something that is man-made.